Chicago streets roared as chants collided with flashing sirens. And then it all turned tense. The city's heartbeat was no longer the rumble of trains beneath its streets, but the pounding rhythm of thousands of voices rising in defiance. Cardboard signs bobbed like waves in a storm, their messages scrawled in bold strokes. No human is illegal. Families belong together. The air was thick with urgency. Helicopters hovered above, their spotlights slicing across faces streaked with sweat and determination. A line of ICE vehicles glistened under the glare, engines idling, lights pulsing red and blue like a warning signal to anyone who dared to step closer. On the ground, protesters pressed shoulder to shoulder, the chants cascading, English and Spanish intertwining into a chorus of survival. Children clung to parents. Elders gripped canes but refused to step back. Across from them, officers in tactical gear formed a wall of authority, shields reflecting the fury of the crowd. The tension wasn't abstract. It was alive, electric, vibrating through every step, every raised fist, every heartbeat daring to stand against power. And as the gap between the two sides narrowed, one question lingered in the charged air. Who would flinch first? But what happened in the next few minutes would ignite a national firestorm. The protest did not appear from thin air. It was born of wounds, fresh, raw, and carried in the hearts of families who had been told again and again that their place in America was conditional. For weeks, ICE raids had torn through immigrant neighborhoods across the Midwest, leaving behind empty chairs at dinner tables, unopened lunchboxes on kitchen counters, and children waiting at bus stops for parents who would never arrive. Each knock at the door had become a drumbeat of fear, and Chicago, a city that prided itself on being a sanctuary, could no longer stay silent. That night, the streets became a refuge of defiance. Mothers marched with strollers, pushing their toddlers forward as if to say, "This is who you are threatening." Teenagers draped themselves in American flags, not as symbols of compliance, but as reminders that belonging is not dictated by paperwork. Faith leaders stood at the edges, holding candles, their flames trembling in the breeze, yet refusing to die out. Activists locked arms, forming human chains that stretched across intersections, daring ICE to push them aside. Everywhere you looked, there was both fragility and fierceness. A grandmother clutching rosary beads whispered prayers under her breath, while next to her, a college student with a bullhorn shouted slogans until her voice cracked. Their differences didn't matter. In that moment, the shared understanding was clear. If they allowed fear to dictate the future, their communities would vanish, piece by piece, raid by raid. But this was never only about Chicago. To the crowd, the city was a stage, and the nation was the audience. They knew cameras were rolling, live streams flickering on phones across the country. Each chant, each raised sign, each child's face peeking from behind a parent's legs carried a message. What happens here reveals who America really is. Were the nation's promises of liberty and justice just slogans etched in textbooks, or living principles that demanded defense when tested? The tension swelled as word spread that ICE was near. Sirens cut sharper, echoing through the canyon of buildings. A ripple moved through the crowd, first whispers, then shouts. "They're coming." Parents pulled children closer, but no one left. Instead, the chants grew louder, as if volume alone could hold the line. Activists hoisted their signs higher, their voices hoarse but unyielding. The air itself seemed to vibrate between two worlds, one of fear, one of resistance. For the protesters, this was no longer about politics or policy papers. It was about survival, about the right to live without constant dread, to see their children grow up without the shadow of sudden disappearances. It was about dignity, the simple, universal demand to be seen as human. Every story in that crowd was different, but together they told the same truth. No law could erase their existence. And then, at the edge of the street, a line of ICE officers emerged. Their boots struck the pavement in unison, shields gleaming under the harsh lights, eyes hidden behind visors. The chants faltered for a heartbeat, not in surrender, but in shock at the sight of power materialized. The protesters had come expecting intimidation, but the moment ICE appeared, the protests crossed a line no one expected. ICE was not just a force on the streets that night. It was a system, a machine built to operate with precision and authority. Born from a web of federal mandates and immigration laws, it was tasked with enforcing borders, upholding statutes, and maintaining law and order. Yet the very order it claimed to protect often unraveled in the neighborhoods it targeted. For decades, families had lived in the shadow of raids, a shadow that could fall at any moment, leaving lives fractured and futures uncertain. It was a bureaucracy with teeth, and it had learned to use them without hesitation. Across the country, headlines told stories of the raids. Children sent to foster care, parents detained without explanation, communities left in shock and grief. In small towns and sprawling cities alike, ICE's presence was a warning. Compliance was demanded. Humanity was optional. And yet, paradoxically, the agency's defenders often spoke of justice, fairness, and protection. They painted themselves as guardians of safety, upholding the rule of law. But the rule of law, in practice, became a hammer striking those who had already endured enough. Homes were raided under the cover of darkness, families separated, dreams deferred. The contradictions were stark. Protect the nation by dismantling the very people who sought to contribute to it. Arrogance seeped into every calculated step. Orders were followed without pause for empathy. Officers moved through streets like shadows with purpose, helmets and shields forming barriers not just to physical confrontation, but to recognition of pain. The humanity of those in front of them was treated as irrelevant, a statistic in a system designed to be unflinching, unyielding, and unquestioned. Reports of distress, cries of children, or pleas from parents were cataloged and ignored. Confidence in authority had hardened into inflexibility, and with that inflexibility came the assumption that fear was sufficient to maintain control. And yet, for all the precision, all the training, all the insistence on order, there was a fragility that ICE could not admit. Every raid carried the risk of exposure, of public scrutiny, of a backlash that statistics and policy papers could not erase. Every family removed from its home was a story waiting to spark outrage, a single spark that could ignite wider resistance. But on that night in Chicago, all of that institutional weight faced something it could not simply contain. A crowd that refused to yield. A chorus of voices determined to be heard. Because opposite from the armored vehicles and rigid formation stood voices unwilling to be silenced. Across the street from the armored vehicles and rigid lines of ICE, a different kind of force gathered. Not one forged in policy manuals or tactical training, but in courage, resilience, and the quiet, persistent belief in human dignity. They were Chicago's heroes that night. Not celebrated, not televised, but unmistakably present. Community leaders who had spent decades organizing food drives, legal clinics, and safe spaces now stood shoulder to shoulder with students, parents, and immigrant families, forming a human barricade of hope against the looming machinery of fear. Among them was Anna, a young activist whose voice had carried across city council meetings and local rallies. Her determination had been tested before, yet tonight it would be stretched further. She held a megaphone in one hand and a worn notebook in the other, ready to transform the crowd's chants into statements that no policy paper could ignore. Beside her, Father Miguel clutched his Bible, offering prayers and quiet counsel to those trembling with anxiety. Every time he lifted his voice, the crowd felt steadied, anchored in a sense of purpose deeper than fear. And there was Rosa, a mother whose child clung to her cult like a lifeline. She had spent weeks preparing, rehearsing what to say, how to shield her son from the trauma of what might unfold. Yet as she scanned the crowd, she saw not just uncertainty, but unwavering solidarity. Around her, strangers became allies, arms linked, hearts synchronized in a rhythm of defiance. Their collective presence spoke louder than any protest sign could. Each individual carried personal stakes. Some had relatives recently detained, some faced threats to their own immigration status, and others risked arrest simply for standing up. Yet none faltered. Their resolve was a quiet rebellion, a refusal to let fear dictate their existence. Every chant, every step forward, every raised sign was a statement. Dignity is not negotiable. Humanity is not optional. The diversity of the crowd underscored its strength. Students with laptops open to live stream the event mingled with elders who had lived through decades of marginalization. Their voices blended into a single chorus. Parents whispered protective instructions, while young activists rallied the group to project confidence beyond their numbers. Even the journalists on the perimeter sensed it. The energy was contagious, a force that demanded attention and respect. In this collective, heroism was ordinary. It was the courage to show up, to risk everything for a principle larger than oneself. It was the determination to remind a city, a nation, and a system designed to instill fear that these communities would not be erased. And though no one knew exactly how the night would unfold, there was an unspoken understanding. This was more than a protest. It was a stand for identity, for family, for dignity, the essence of what it meant to belong. But beneath the chants and courage, a storm waited. The armored vehicles, the officers, the looming presence of ICE. It was only a matter of time before the first confrontation began. The air was electric, charged with a tension that had been building for hours. Chants that had started as a steady murmur swelled into a thunderous roar, shaking the streets and rattling the windows of nearby buildings. "No human is illegal," the protesters cried. "Families belong together." Each voice carried weight, amplified by a sea of bodies pressed together in solidarity. Across from them, ICE officers tightened their formation, shields locking into place, batons poised, helmets reflecting the harsh glare of streetlights. The machinery of authority was ready, but the spirit of defiance was equally unyielding. Anna lifted her megaphone, her voice cutting above the din. "You will not erase us. You will not divide us." The crowd surged behind her, fists raised, voices trembling with passion and fear. Every syllable was a defiance, a challenge to the power that sought to intimidate them. An ICE officer bellowed orders, attempting to reclaim control. "Step back! Disperse now!" But the words fell flat against the unbroken human chain. The officer's precision and discipline clashed with the raw, messy humanity before them, highlighting the stark polarity: rigid authority versus living dignity, intimidation versus unbowed spirit. For a moment, the street held its breath. Protesters swayed, children clung to parents, elders raised their voices in prayers that mingled with shouts. Every footstep and gesture became a statement of principle. Every pause in chanting felt like a heartbeat caught in suspense, a silent question hanging in the charged air. Who would yield first? And then, small provocations escalated. A protester stepped slightly forward, a hand extended in defiance. An officer advanced, baton lifted. Voices clashed with commands, reality clashing with expectation. Tension spiraled, a tightrope stretched over a canyon of fear and courage. The city seemed to lean in, watching, waiting. And then, screams pierced the air as the line broke. A stumble, a shout, and for a heartbeat, chaos threatened to overtake order. Children screamed, parents shouted, and officers struggled to regain the rhythm of control. Yet even in that fracture, the crowd did not crumble. The protest had reached its tipping point, teetering between fear and fury, between suppression and the unshakable conviction that their presence mattered. Every gaze met another, a silent understanding passing between strangers. This was no ordinary night, no ordinary demonstration. The forces of intimidation had met the living proof of resilience. And as the smoke of tension swirled around them, every person in the street realized that the next moments would define not just the outcome of this protest, but the story that the nation would carry forward. The street vibrated with sound. Chants, screams, and the rhythmic pounding of feet blended into a storm that seemed almost alive. ICE's show of force, so calculated and precise, was suddenly dwarfed by the sheer magnitude of collective will. Shields rattled under the pressure of arms locked shoulder to shoulder, and helmets reflected the fiery determination that refused to yield. For a moment, the machinery of authority looked human only in its fragility, teetering against a wave it could neither control nor predict. Anna stepped forward, her voice cutting through the chaos with a clarity that made heads turn. The megaphone trembled slightly in her hands, but her words were unwavering. We are your neighbors, your colleagues, your students. We are human beings, and no law, no order, no badge can erase that. The effect was instantaneous. The street fell into a brief, suspended silence, as if the city itself had inhaled and held its breath. Even the officers froze, visors catching glints of light while their formations wavered for the first time. A single line of humanity had cut through the armor of intimidation. Shields rattled under the pressure of arms locked shoulder to shoulder, and helmets reflected the fiery determination that refused to yield. For a moment, the machinery of authority looked human only in its fragility, teetering against the wave it could neither control nor predict. Anna stepped forward, her voice cutting through the chaos with a clarity that made heads turn. The megaphone trembled slightly in her hands, but her words were unwavering. We are your neighbors, your colleagues, your students. We are human beings, and no law, no order, no badge can erase that. The words struck like a bell. For a heartbeat, the street was still. Then, like a wave breaking on rocks, applause, chants, and cries erupted in unison. Every body moved, every mouth spoke, every eye reflected the defiance that had crystallized in that single line. Shields rattled again, officers stepped back slightly, and the rhythm of control faltered. The power dynamic had shifted. The mic drop moment was complete. Around the crowd, the ripple effect rippled. Journalists filming on smartphones caught the moment, their lenses capturing the faces of triumph, fear, and unbroken resolve. The live stream overflowed with comments. Viewers thousands of miles away felt as if they had been transported into the street themselves, witnessing the overthrow of authority by something far stronger than rules: human dignity. The cinematic tension of the moment was palpable. Sweat and tears mingled on cheeks, breaths came in ragged gasps, and yet no one moved backward. The energy was not just resistance, it was transformation. The street had been claimed not by force, but by the assertion of moral clarity. Every chant now carried a new layer, a history of struggle, a testimony of persistence, a declaration that fear could not dominate those willing to stand. In this suspended, cinematic beat, the crowd became more than a crowd. They were the story incarnate, a living statement that courage could confront even the most formidable systems. And for ICE, the psychological fracture was undeniable. Their presence, once imposing, had become a mirror reflecting the humanity they had chosen to ignore. Their formation remained, but their certainty had eroded, replaced by a rare hesitation, the kind that comes when power meets principle and principle refuses to bend. The mic drop reverberated far beyond the street. Social media feeds lit up. Clips of the moment traveled across the nation, sparking debates, inspiring other communities, and igniting conversations about dignity, justice, and the limits of authority. Celebrities, activists, and ordinary citizens all responded, amplifying the message that had been so powerfully delivered in Chicago. And yet, even in the triumph, there was a breath held, a recognition that the night was not yet over. The officers had retreated, their intimidation faltering, but the story, the moral, the momentum, the spark, was just beginning to spread. And while I stepped back, the ripple effect had only just begun. The echoes of that night in Chicago did not fade with the sirens or the last chants. They rippled outward, carried first through the glowing screens of smartphones, then into homes, offices, and classrooms across the nation. Clips of Anna's declaration, the protesters' unwavering presence, and the moment ICE faltered were uploaded, shared, and reshared within minutes. Hashtags like Chicago Stands, hashtag Dignity Over Fear, and hashtag Families Belong Together began trending, not as empty slogans, but as rallying cries, digital monuments to courage. Social media became a conduit for both awe and outrage. Thousands commented, many sharing their own stories of raids, fear, and resilience, creating a chorus that mirrored the street itself. Faces from the protests appeared on live streams, interviews, and reaction videos. The footage circulated rapidly, a pulse that seemed to synchronize millions of viewers to the heartbeat of Chicago's courage. For those watching from afar, the city's streets were not distant. They were immediate, visceral, and impossible to ignore. The cultural and political elite could not look away. Politicians tweeted, some in praise, some in condemnation, their statements amplifying the narrative in ways that blurred the line between commentary and consequence. Journalists dissected the event, analyzing the tactics, the risks, the symbolism, each frame a story of tension, defiance, and morality. Celebrities weighed in, lending their voices and platforms, projecting the impact far beyond local streets into national discourse. Every opinion, every endorsement, every critique fed the growing momentum, ensuring that what had begun as a localized protest would not remain confined. Within Chicago, the community felt transformed. Strangers who had linked arms that night now carried a shared sense of purpose and validation. Neighborhoods buzzed with conversations, planning future meetings, rallies, and initiatives. Local leaders, emboldened by the success of one stand, began strategizing long-term campaigns to protect families and assert their rights. The energy was tangible, a collective confidence that even the presence of intimidation could not extinguish. Meanwhile, for the national audience, the experience was unexpectedly immersive. Millions who weren't there still felt like they stood in that street, hearts pounding with each chant, eyes drawn to every sign and gesture. Viewers felt the courage, the fear, the resolve, and the moral clarity of the moment as though it were theirs. Social media comment threads were filled with confessions of solidarity, cries for change, and promises to act, all evidence that the story had transcended geography to become a shared cultural moment. The narrative had shifted. What ICE had intended as control and deterrence became, in retrospect, a catalyst for empowerment. The dialogue around immigrant rights, human dignity, and civic responsibility was no longer theoretical. It was immediate, tangible, and impossible to ignore. People spoke of the protests in boardrooms, classrooms, and kitchens, transforming a single street confrontation into a conversation that stretched across the country. As the night's images and footage continued to circulate, the line between Chicago and the rest of America blurred. Ordinary citizens became participants in the story, witnesses to courage, interpreters of justice, and carriers of a shared moral truth. The streets may have quieted, but the resonance of that confrontation was only growing, echoing far beyond the city limits, carrying with it the knowledge that resistance, when grounded in dignity, could ignite a fire no force could contain. And yet, for those who had stood shoulder to shoulder that night, the greatest realization was clear. The impact of their courage was only beginning to unfold. As the lights of Chicago dimmed and the streets emptied, the weight of the night lingered like a quiet pulse. The confrontation had ended, but its lesson resonated far beyond the city limits. Dignity, once under threat, had emerged stronger than fear. The chants, the signs, the linked arms of strangers, each gesture a refusal to bow, demonstrated that unity could drown out intimidation. In that charged, uncertain space, humanity had spoken louder than authority. This was more than a local protest. It became a mirror for the nation, reflecting a fundamental choice. Would America continue down a path of cruelty, enforcing rules without regard for families, children, or community? Or would it embrace compassion, recognizing the shared humanity in every face, every story, every heartbeat? The standoff was never just ICE versus protesters. It was a crossroads, a moral test that demanded clarity. In the quiet moments after the street emptied, that truth crystallized. Courage rooted in dignity has a power no system of control can contain. The individuals who had stood that night carried more than personal bravery. They carried a story for every city, every neighborhood, and every person who had ever felt marginalized, silenced, or unseen. Their resistance was a statement, a living argument for the values many Americans claim to hold but so often fail to practice. And it worked because it was rooted not in spectacle, but in authenticity, empathy, and relentless courage. Across the nation, hearts were stirred. Social media amplified their message. Ordinary citizens felt a renewed sense of possibility, and even skeptics could not ignore the clarity of the moment. Chicago had become an emblem, a visual and emotional proof that when people lock arms in solidarity, when they choose unity over fear, no force, no matter how well-trained, well-equipped, or well-intentioned in its own eyes, can erase their humanity. The crescendo was not in violence or in headlines, but in the quiet, undeniable truth that morality, courage, and shared purpose could bend the arc of a moment toward justice. The city had spoken, families had stood, students had chanted, elders had prayed, and in doing so, they had illuminated a path forward for anyone willing to rise above fear, to act with conviction, and to believe that dignity, above all, is the most powerful weapon in the fight for justice. Chicago proved, in the end, that when people lock arms, no force can erase their humanity. Yes, the ICE protests turned tense, but out of that tension came a truth no one can ignore. What unfolded on the streets of Chicago was more than a confrontation. It was a testament to courage, community, and the unyielding power of dignity. In a moment when fear threatened to dominate, people chose to stand together, to raise their voices, and to remind the world that humanity cannot be silenced by intimidation or force. The lesson is clear. Truth is stronger than fear, and community is louder than division. When ordinary citizens rise in solidarity, when voices join across generations, cultures, and backgrounds, the impact is unstoppable. The ripple effect stretches far beyond a single city, touching hearts and inspiring action across the nation. If you believe dignity still matters in America, share this story. Let it travel beyond Chicago, beyond social media, beyond the headlines. Subscribe and join a movement that refuses to be silenced, a movement that believes in justice, in empathy, and in the courage of ordinary people to create extraordinary change. The streets of Chicago may have quieted, but the echoes are still being heard. And as long as people remember, stand, and speak, those echoes will continue to grow, carrying a simple but undeniable truth: humanity will always rise.